Welcome to Captain Forest podcast Hero's Voice. Captain Forest is an international movement for a plastic-free, waste-free and permaculture world.
Kenya will produce a lot of crops and Switzerland will produce a lot of financial services. There is an imbalance. That's how colonial powers work nowadays. And that's why I, born in Lausanne, Switzerland, will have much more facility to get a salary of $50,000 a year than anyone born in Malawi. And that has nothing to do with brain power, with merit or stuff like that. Just that some countries are maintained in current world affairs and current economic system in a state of cheap labor and resource reserves.
And they somehow maintained these dictatures and poverty in these countries because they need to produce at low cost.
There's a very famous book called How Europe Underdeveloped Africa.
Hello, welcome to Hero's Voice by Captain Forest. Today we are happy to welcome Victor Cannilla, ex-trader, ex-BCG Consultant and currently researcher in political science at the University of Geneva. Today we are going to speak about capitalism, an economic system with its pros and cons, but what we are trying to understand is how capitalism industrialized life to serve its infinite growth model. So Victor, you left a brilliant career behind you to focus on environmental and economic issues. Can you introduce yourself?
With pleasure. Thanks for having me. So I left trading in 2016 and then left BCG or consulting as an industry in 2021, mainly for ecological reasons, but also for ethical and intellectual reasons. So maybe I'll go through these three sets of reasons. In terms of environmental concerns, I think the situation is bad enough to deserve that we really reflect on our careers and what we are doing with most of our time. Because when you're doing a 40, 50, 60, 70 sometimes hour per week job, it's your main activity and the main source of energy. So I think it does deserve a bit of attention, just even more than what you eat or how we travel or stuff like that. Then the more ethical concerns were in the kind of what kind of clients am I helping and what kind of dynamics am I helping, either in finance or in consulting. And third, the analytical or intellectual reasons is that I found that always having to answer questions with a business imperative, or a business case to be proven and so on, is not a good way to have full intellectual liberty and intellectual freedom to be able to research what you want and say what you want.
So today we want to answer this question of how capitalism industrialized life to serve its infinite growth model. So at first, I think it's important to understand the different concept behind. So can you tell us what's capitalism?
Sure. So I think capitalism in academia and in political life is sometimes seen as difficult to define. I think that's not true. If you take a very broad definition, that would be a social system constructed around the imperative of infinite profits for the sake of infinite accumulation. So to me, any system that's centered around accumulation and profits, and more precisely private profits, private hands, can be defined as capitalism. That's very concrete. For example, if you take an empire, an ancient empire of the Mediterranean world, the notion of private was a bit different than what we would have today, and the definition of profits certainly wasn't as central. And what you had back in those days of empires struggling for control around the Mediterranean would be more of a cultural domination, territorial domination, and certainly accumulating wealth for king, but that wouldn't be the end goal. Whereas what we have today in capitalism is a system that's structured around entities that are some new entities in history, some stuff like corporations, that aim only the goal of having a profitable bottom line, a revenue minus cost that's above zero, and to redistribute that to financiers. And financiers, which we can label the core capitalists, are investing not only in those corporations to get profits and return on investment, but more recently in all kind of asset classes. Actually, it's quite old that you have different asset classes, but now there's really an inflation of the number of asset classes in which capitalists can invest, notably speculation on commodities, but also speculation on real estate, rent extraction from debt, and these types of investments. And really, when you look at social or political topics in the current days, you often find that if you go deeply through the reflection, you arrive to the bottom line where profit is central, or you arrive to the conclusion where capitalist interests really are an important agent, not the only agent, but an important agent of current societies. And the issue of current environmental destructions, plural, is definitely also in that realm of the social dynamics or biological dynamics or climate dynamics that have, in the end, some of their causes within this mindset and end goal of profit accumulation.
Okay, interesting. And so can you explain us what is the infinite growth model?
Sure. So I think when we speak about growth, and when some people speak about degrowth and put the focus on growth, to me, it's more a consequence than a goal. It needs refining, but the source of growth, when we look at charts of exponential growth since the 1850s that accelerate since the 1950s after World War II, these exponentials actually predate the time where growth was really a state objective. So if we take the explosion of production in industrialized Great Britain, France, Germany, United States between, let's say, 1830 and 1880, by the time that it was really taking a lot of inertia, the states weren't declaring at that time that growth was an end goal or a mindset, or that we had to grow. What you had in the day was more of a ideology of civilization, superior civilization. So we see that this explosion in production goes hand in hand with imperial projects, colonial projects, and cultural projects of superior civilization that are supposed to export their model to the whole world, but that it really predates the growth mindset. Then in the 1930s, you have whole sets of economic ideas, notably of aggregate demand with John Maynard Keynes and thinkers like that, that will then place with the US plan to tackle the Great Depression of 1929, really a focus on trying to launch aggregate demand in order to stimulate the economy, in order to get jobs. And then during World War II, and already a bit before that, but during World War II, you really see governments starting to track production and to set growth of GDP as an enabler for good military capacity. So GDP really has a connection through industrial production of weapons during the world wars. And then after 1945, you really have states that put growth as a macroeconomic objective. You also have some kind of ideological uniformization in the economic field, what we call today mainstream economics, that becomes really dominant in the 50s. And all of that is centered around growth of GDP. But I would say that the root of the growth of GDP is really more ancient and has more to do with the ideology of a eternal progress of civilization, and also of this capitalist goal of endless accumulation and of profits, so of lucrative investments.
Okay, so GDP was created somehow in between First and Second World War, when they needed to track and get data on how things were produced. Can you tell us how GDP is calculated?
Sure. So you have different ways. I think that a scholar definition would go through the value-added approach and through the total expense approach and so on. So you have different accounting methods, but the bottom line is that you try to look within a certain territory, whether it's nationally determined or in the case of the gross national product, or in the case of the uh, gross domestic product. It also includes production of entities that are outside the territories, but that belong to national entities. So that allows for multinational corporations tracking and so on. But the end goal really is to sum up the all the different items and services that are produced and summed by their market value.
So if I understand well, the objective of capitalism is the accumulation of capital, and this is possible through profit maximization, and therefore businesses, they must continuously grow their sales and revenue. And on the other hand, as you just explained, the way we calculate GDP, it seems that like consumption and production are at the heart of this system. Can you explain how this continuous growth of production and consumption are at the heart of the capitalism system?
Yeah, sure. So you said lots of different interesting elements. Maybe the way most sociologists and historians see the causality is that if we look, for example, at the work of Max Weber, who's considered one of the founding fathers of sociology, you have really his description of an ethics of capitalism that some people would even call an aesthetic of capitalism, that back in his days in the 19th and early 20th century were really structured around people who were a bit like John D. Rockefeller, the founding father of Standard Oil, so big magnate in oil in the late 19th and early 20th century that is estimated to be the richest person ever, or the richest capitalist ever. His model was more of frugality. So you have people that really have as a mindset to maximize their investment just in order to maximize their total capital. So that's what you said in terms of accumulation of capital. And that's really frenetic. You cannot refrain it. And you spend your whole life chasing that. There is no precise moment where enough is enough, and so on. Now, the easiest way to do that, if you're a John D. Rockefeller or a JP Morgan, or more recently some other figures, is that you maximize production. Because if you have a certain firm, if you have a certain economic activity, there's only so much that you can cut in terms of costs. So of course, investing in technology enables you to be more efficient in terms of hiring less, or in terms of spending less raw resources for a certain product. Sure. So cutting labor costs and investing in technology is definitely a way to increase profits. But an even more lucrative way, if you look at history, is to grow production and to activate new markets, as we would sometimes recommend as consultants. If you go through a big corporation as a consultant and they ask you for major sources of profit growth, the first thing you're going to look at is where is a growth of market, or even a creation of a new market. So to create new markets, what you need to do is basically stimulate demand, stimulate consumption, stimulate desires for some things that did not exist previously. So for example, iPhones. Back in the 1990s, humanity was not craving for having iPhones. But when some people realized that you had sufficient maturity in some underlying technologies, and you could assemble that into a product and sell more and more of that product, you can make huge profits. And by the way, Apple became the most valuable company in the world in the recent years. Then you have huge profits opportunity. So the growth, let's say the accumulation of capital through profits, requires or is best attained through the creation of new markets that imply new needs. That is what we call sometimes in French société de consommation. That I don't think is much used in English, consumption society. Consumerism to me is a bit a wrong term, because it's not like some people woke up and said, I'm a capitalist, or some others said I'm a communist, and some others said I'm a consumerist. No, no one says I'm a consumerist. It's more something that fall on people, that you are a 14 years old girl, teenager, for example, and you're always spread by advertisement on how your body should be and how your dress code should be and stuff like that, and that fuels the perception that you need to do some stuff, and that triggers sometimes, or most often, irrational or unconscious desires. And marketing people often study neuroscience and these kind of fields to really be good at triggering that. And therefore, I would say that consumption and infinite consumption is in the end a symptom of infinite production, that is itself a symptom of infinite capital accumulation through profits.
Okay, very interesting. So at first, they wanted to produce and they needed to stimulate consumption, and they used several methods in order to create these needs. And people, at the first place, they are not consumers, they are just individuals, but they became consumers because we want them to become consumers. It's
Absolutely.
very interesting. So I think it's fair today to talk about sort of life industrialization, just because everything is used in order to produce. Like, humans are laborers, natural resources are used in order to produce goods. So it's like life is used as assets in order to produce several types of goods. So can you explain what is this life industrialization to serve the capitalist purpose?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think the phrase life industrialization is interesting. I would say that it's more of what you said in your question that corresponds to the truth, is life used as an asset and life used as raw material. And actually the output is goods. And I'd say the output is dead.
Exactly.
So actually, I wonder if instead of life industrialization, the phrase death industrialization shouldn't be used. And actually, what we've come about nowadays in society, if we look at not only at humans, but at the total planet, and my background is in physics, so I did study a bit other celestial corpses, let's say, other stars and other planets. And as far as we know, the phenomenon that we have on Earth, that's called life, is unique. So if we look at this unique phenomena in the universe, as far as we know it, that's life. What we're doing right now is basically a massive machine to kill. Many places that were once very diverse and very vibrant and very soaked with life, today are fields of only one crop, with artificial products in the ground to kill insects that might be tempted to eat the crop, or to kill the rodents like rats or whatever, or mice that might eat that stuff. So we've basically transformed a big chunk of the planet, of the land mass, into fields that are totally measured, tracked, optimized biologically, even in terms of DNA with the seed business, and in terms of how they grow with all the agrochemical industry that's really made in order to maximize the outputs for humans. And that's what we could call industrial production of food for humans, but that's also industrial death production for all the rest. Maybe the notable exception where we could say that massive industrialization of the world has brought growth in life, at least in number of living beings, is for the cattle we eat and the meat we eat. It used to be mostly pigs, mostly chicken, of course, and then pigs, beef, and stuff like that. But nowadays it's also fish. Now there's more fish that's being grown in artificial plants, fish plants, like you have cow plants, than fish that's being fished, because we've basically killed, or maybe we'll return to the we. I don't like to use we. That's like everyone has the same responsibility. Like the farmer in Malawi has the same responsibility than the banker on Wall Street. I don't think so. But let's keep a we, generic we for humanity for now. Basically, humans have killed most fish in the ocean, so it's more lucrative now to just grow it. So in terms of headcounts, there are more humans and there are more living food for humans. And all the fields that we have, a big part of that goes into fueling the beef industry and being raw food for the beef industry. Then you might also take on a philosophical hat and ask whether this is really life. Are people all doing the same job in the 9 to 5, really homogeneous career, very repetitive, really living beings? Actually, when Europeans arrived in the Americas, and even recently, when some tribes were being in first contacts, for example, in Brazil in the 20th century with the Brazilian descendant of whites and black slaves and stuff like that, they were saying, but your model is crappy. Like, you guys are only working and doing a very repetitive job, and some bosses give you order. Like, why are you doing that? So even the winners in what we could call the industrially developed countries are not so alive, we could say, philosophically. But another way to put it is also that our food and the massive headcount of animals on the planet is also not very alive. If you look at a industrial chicken, it's optimized to grow as fast as possible and to be killed as fast as possible. It's basically living in very densely populated plants, so in very poor hygiene conditions, full of medicine in order not to get sick and to spread that as epidemics. So we're really playing with life and actually destructing life, I would say, in this industrial capitalist mode of production.
So life has been industrialized, or death has been industrialized to serve this infinite growth model, but we ignored something very important, which is the planetary boundaries. So what are the limits of our economic system?
Yeah, so it's been a debate for a long time of whether capitalism hurts people or not. Let's put that aside for now, and let's just go into what you're saying, which is environmental or planetary boundaries and really ecological constraints. It's been well acknowledged since the late 19th century that if we burn too much coal, and that's also true for oil and gas, but that wasn't that much of a big deal at the time. If we burn too much coal, we're gonna have an atmospheric issue. And that was people like Svante Arrhenius, who got a Nobel Prize in chemistry, who said stuff like that. So not just regular folks, really prominent scientists. That's an example of such a limit. If we burn stuff that releases some gas like CO2 in the atmosphere, you're gonna change the atmosphere, and at some point you're gonna trigger some systemic effect of disruptions. Or some rising temperatures that have some effects on meteorological events like hurricanes, or like droughts, or like floods, which are very deadly in terms of mass hunger that they can trigger, or even natural disasters like we saw in Pakistan recently with massive floods, but also the rise in hurricanes. I think there's absolutely no doubt amongst meteorologists and climatologists that hurricanes are increasing in intensity and in frequency because of our burning of fossil fuels. So that's one example that's very notorious, that's climate change, which is one of the planetary limits that we're destroying. Now there's a framework that's called the planetary limits framework from the Stockholm Resilience Center, that basically gathers 9 such limits, and climate change is only one of them. And in every single limit that we've been able to measure, or that the professional searchers of those fields have been able to measure, I think it's 6 out of the 9 so far, we're way above the limit. Some of them in really, really worrying way, like what we do with water, or like we do with the cycles of nitrogen and other molecules that are really important for industrial agriculture. So we're basically exploding all planetary boundaries. Now, it's not necessarily trivial or obvious to you if you live in Paris or if you live in Geneva or if you live in Nairobi. It's going to be more obvious to you if you're a countryside farmer in rural India. Then you're going to see the patterns of rain change. But if you're in Paris and you just buy your carrots at Carrefour, you might see prices changing. You might see the origins changing. You might not even notice it, but you won't necessarily measure that there are more hurricanes in Madagascar. So that's what's a bit tricky with those planetary boundary frameworks, is that there is really scientific consensus that it's bad, that we're in a catastrophic situation, and that we need to stop industrial production, that we need to stop focusing our economic system on private profits and stuff like that. But it's not yet obvious in parts of the world where we gain most in not seeing it.
One of the answers presented today to face the climate crisis is to reduce carbon emissions. In one of your interviews, you talked about the foolishness to tackle the entire environmental crisis using only one measure, which is carbon emission reduction. You explained how foolish it is from the part of consulting firms to let people believe that if we reduce carbon emissions, then the job is done. Even though minimizing carbon and generally GHG emission is certainly a wise decision, but if we pursue only this objective, in a way, isn't it like maintaining the status quo?
Yeah, right. So thanks. That's a very good question. By the way, I wish that we were reducing emissions. I wish that would already be good. It's not enough, as I'll explain, but that would already be good. But we're so far away from that. We're actually increasing public subsidies to fossil fuel companies who are making record profits, who are doing very well. And we're increasing emissions like crazy, like we've always done so far since coal has become a big deal in the 19th century. So we're really not getting there, despite all the corporate greenwashing and corporate propaganda that we hear everywhere, notably spread by consulting companies, but basically the whole corporate world spreads it. A lot of professors also spread it, professors of economics, professors of business, professors of the biggest MBA or business schools in the world are also in that ideology of, let's say, the net zero. Also, a lot of NGOs are doing it. If you really look at the genealogy of net zero, as if you look at the genealogy of carbon footprint, you see that often it's actually a rhetoric that has been designed by public relations company for big oil companies. So that's a very convenient rhetoric. Basically, if you say net zero, you can say, what matters is not that we stop emitting carbon emissions, that we stop emitting greenhouse gases, is that what we emit is offset by something else. And then you have a whole business model of tracking, measuring, and doing carbon offsets, some with technologies, some others with more basic stuff like planting trees. Every time anyone has looked in detail into how this works, we see that this is bullshit, that this is not enough, that the technologies are stupid or not working or not enough, etc., and that it's very dangerous to rely on net zero and that we just need to reduce the emissions. But of course, that's something that the corporate world in its current state of total submission, of total vassalisation, as we say in French, as total state of subjugation to the profit maximization imperative and financialized capitalism and so on, which is almost a tautology. Financial capitalism is capitalism has always been financial, but whatever. The term financial capitalism does have a validity, but let's not go into details. So all this cannot be heard and is not pronounced at the moment within the big corporations, and for a good reason, is that if we do reduce the emissions of greenhouse gases, notably of carbon emission, then we are tackling the major source of energy on the planet. We have to realize that if GDP grew in a colossal way since the 1850s and even more so since the 1950s, is because machines are doing a lot of the job. And machines need fuel, just as beef needs fuel from food, or you and I do from food. Machines need fuel, and the main energy source for machines is by more than 80% on a global scale, just oil, coal, and gas, natural gas. So we're still in the fossil fuel paradigm, and reducing emissions would mean reducing production, which would mean colossal collapse in GDP, and which would mean intolerable profit losses, and which would mean weaker states and weaker military power. So all the powerful entity, or most of the powerful entities in the world, cannot even speak about that. But even if they would speak about that, and even if they would go beyond just speaking about that and doing it, we would still not solve everything. And that's what I meant in the interview, that focusing only on carbon emission or on greenhouse gases is seeing only one of those 9 planetary limits, and we're not seeing the water limit. So the example I often heard and I often give myself is that even if you have let's say machines that are totally clean in terms of greenhouse gas emissions in the Amazon, cutting the forest, you will still cut the forest, and you will still have destroyed a lot of life, and you will still have replaced forest and animal life and vegetal life and beauty of life by stupid stuff like big cities or supermarkets and people going to office jobs. So this is what I meant by focusing only on climate, we miss all other problems like water, pollution, acidification of the oceans, and of course the collapse on life on Earth. And I could give more detail on the 6th mass extinction, but let me just drop the terms for people who are curious about that. Let me remind that the collapse of life that we're triggering right now has no parallel since the dinosaurs collapsed 65 million years ago. So it's a very big deal.
Yeah, reducing carbon emissions and greenhouse gas emission in general is very important, but it's not the only thing that we need to do in order to face the environmental crisis. For example, you can be a company that reduce its carbon emission, but at the same time release chemicals in the river. You could kill wildlife. You can overuse plastic and just dispose them anywhere. So reducing carbon emissions is very important, but it's not the only objective that companies need to pursue.
And maybe, Lamia, if you allow me, I can illustrate that by a very simple fact. It's the fact that the equivalent of the IPCC, so IPCC is the body of research mandated and created by the UN to research climate change. The equivalent in terms of biodiversity or of life, let's say, is called the IPBES. And they produce research where they document why life is collapsing on Earth. And currently, if you look at why life is dwindling, you see that there are 5 main causes. And I think at the moment, climate change is only number 3 or 4. So we are already changing the climate. We are already seeing the Alps that have less snow, or the hurricanes that are more numerous. That's nothing compares to what awaits us if we continue on that track. But what is killing life so far is not even climate. It's stuff like we cut the forest. It's stuff like we overfish. It's stuff like we put too many roads so animals cannot cross anymore and cannot have their life. So it's more about space. They call that land use. That's the number 1 source. And the number 2 source of life killing is what they call direct predation, which is we directly kill animals for all kind of convenience and all kind of economic use. And as you said, using life as raw material and as input and as assets. So that's another case in point that climate change, or solving the emission problem, the carbon emission problem, is not understanding the full magnitude of the problem.
You also spoke about the political foolishness of letting people believe that events like COP or World Economic Forum will help solve the environmental crisis. At the same time, there are geopolitical considerations larger than the several negotiations led in these COP or World Economic Forum events. I think you've seen this in your job at WWF. Can you tell us more about it?
Yeah, I wish more people working in international NGOs and in COPs and in diplomacy would do a bit more history about the origins of the UN. I'm not saying the UN is bad. I'm saying you have to know its history. The League of Nations was really created by the United States and by European powers in order to control what would happen to their empires. And it was also done in order for the United Nations, then that took over the League of Nations, in order to control when the very large British Empire or the very large French Empire collapsed, and that you had more and more national struggles for freedom from people that had been colonized for centuries, that you have still a way of maintaining that. And if we look at the UN, that's basically a set of very different organizations. The more the organization matters within the UN, the more it's heavily and tightly controlled by the major powers. For example, very notoriously, the Security Council has 5 permanent members. Those 5 were not randomly selected. They were the ones that had the atomic bomb back in the 1950s. Whereas if you look at the UN General Assembly, the UNGA, as people in diplomacy say, that one has pretendedly equal power for every country, which may be true because it doesn't have any power. So if you have democracy within the UN, it's where it doesn't matter. And when you look at climate COPs, UNFCCC COPs, those are basically non-binding treaties for the huge majority with very weak implementation mechanisms, sanction mechanisms. And in order to be accepted, you need unanimity. So it suffices that a major petro extractor like Saudi Arabia or Russia in the case of natural gas, or the US in terms of shale oil and stuff like that, blocks the treaty for it not to happen. So of course, when you have stuff like the Paris Agreement, it can only be symbolic stuff and diplomatic stuff in order for governments to pat each other in the back and so on. So what I mean by people at COPs should be a bit less naive is that, sure, it's good to have a big media opportunity like the Paris Agreement, to have The Guardian and the New York Times speaking about climate. Great, that's fine. And that's fine that we can predict that in 3 years down the road, we will be able to say, hey, guys, you're not respecting what you signed. What is stupid is to expect that this in itself would change anything, because the roots are so much deeper and the magnitudes of the change are so much bigger than what happens in those conferences. So I'm not saying that those conferences should be cancelled. I'm not saying that the UN should not exist. I'm saying that people who rely too much on that are politically naive.
That's true. Okay, so do you think that neocolonialism also is a factor that maintains the current status quo?
I think that the entire system is built on colonialism and maintains it. Yeah, for sure. So you have for example, when the US started to become a big deal in the 19th century, when it got emancipated from Britain in the 18th, it wasn't such a big deal. Of course, the British Crown wasn't happy, but they had other issues. They fought the 7 Years' War with France all over the world and was having big deals in maintaining its grip on the very, very, very lucrative business that was back in the days India. So when the US got free from Britain in 1776, it wasn't such a big deal for the world affairs, but it became a huge deal in the 19th with massive emigration from Europe, from the importance of slave production, notably in the cotton industry, but also in sugar, in tobacco, and all these industries that really made the United States. And at that moment, what you have is a doctrine that's called the Monroe Doctrine, by the name of the US president that pronounced it, I think, in the 1820s, that basically means, yeah, sure, now that we got our independence and that French people did their revolution, and that Latino countries enjoyed the Napoleonic Wars to also get free, and that basically all of Latin America is not Spanish and Portuguese anymore, we, the US, will control our hemisphere, which is the Americas. And you Europeans, you deal with your business, which is India, Africa, and whatever you can in the rest of Asia. So basically, the 19th century and the rise of the United States is intrinsically colonial. And the United States was, in some regards, smarter than Britain and France in order that it didn't go all over Africa like the European powers did in the 19th to plant their flags. And the US maintained its grip over Latin America through more subtle means, like financing governments, financing military, to have coup d'etat in order to take away presidents that were not acting in their business interests and so on. And then that's the model that the US adopted everywhere in the world when basically the big European power self-destructed in World War I and World War II. Britain was not strong anymore in order to maintain its grip over its African domination and over its Indian domination, very famously with the Indian independence and so on. China got on its way and so on. France also got its colonies freed. But what happens from that moment is that the US has a huge control over huge parts of the world. So sure, after World War II, you also have the large sphere of influence of the USSR. So the US is not the only big major power. But if you look at any chart of the domination of world affairs in terms of wealth domination, territorial domination, people domination, profits domination, military domination, and so on, in the world in the 20th century, you see that it's not an equal fight between the US and the USSR, and that the US is really the dominant power. In fact, George Kennan, who was a diplomat in the US at the end of World War II, said we are basically 6%. I don't know if the figures are right, but it's something like that. We're 6% of the people on Earth, and we control 50% of the production. That's unfair, and everyone in the world will complain about that. Our policy goal in international affairs is to maintain this imbalance in our favor, which is normal, which is what you would expect from a state that is number one power in the world. So basically, we think that colonies are over since Africa got freed or since the Bolivarian independencies of Latin America and so on and so forth. But that's a crucial misunderstanding, that colonial powers is not over. So you have all the concept of bananas republic that the US has installed in Latin America over its dominions. You have stuff like the Mossadegh case, because Iran was of crucial importance in the 50s for the US. So when people like Mossadegh in Iran try to nationalize the oil reserves of Iran, the US and the British power that remained, obviously said no, and they sent the CIA to finance a military coup and to kill Mossadegh. A bit of the same story with big African leaders like Patrice Lumumba or Thomas Sankara, a bit like the same that Che Guevara was killed by, I think in Bolivia, by people financed by the United States. So the way that colonialism has worked is not anymore by a big power coming and putting a flag, like the French would say in the 19th century. It's more subtle than that. And it's more, we leave you do your business as long as your government is not doing crazy stuff, like saying that our oil should belong to us. If your government does crazy stuff like that, we're going to have trouble. So we're still basically maintaining world affairs strongly biased towards US domination, with, of course, strong enjoyments from its European allies, military domination by NATO, and things like that. And in the South, what this means is that basically many countries are maintained in the state of low value chain participation in global value chains. So, for example, Kenya will produce a lot of crops, and Switzerland will produce a lot of financial services. There is an imbalance. That's how colonial powers work nowadays. And that's why I, born in Lausanne, Switzerland, will have much more facility to get a salary of $50,000 a year than anyone born in Malawi. And that has nothing to do with brain power, or with merit or stuff like that. Just that some countries are maintained in current world affairs and current economic system in a state of cheap labor and resource reserves.
And they somehow maintained these dictatures and poverty in these countries because they need to produce at low cost.
There's a very famous book called How Europe Underdeveloped Africa. And that breaks away with the idea basically that some people in the West can say we can have win-win and you can be integrated within globalization and you can win, saying that to southern country. The way it works is more that in order for people, rich people and dominant classes in the global north to accumulate more wealth and accumulate more capital and gain more profits, you need to maintain some other people in a state of cheap market, cheap resources, cheap labor. So of course that it's better for Total that the Mozambique gas reserves are still maintained under favorable contracts with French exports, of course. And this means that in Mozambique, the money that could be made from this gas is not evenly distributed to the population. So yeah, absolutely. You don't have it's not totally a zero-sum game, but it's not totally something that you have in a win-win.
Okay. So somehow capitalism is, let's say, it's responsible for mass poverty in the rest of the world. And can we say also that it is responsible for the environmental crisis?
Yeah, that's almost academic debate. My personal opinion is that capitalism is not the only issue, and that imperialism or state power and state domination is also a very big deal. And that when you get stuff like when you go into deep studies of how the CIA, the Pentagon, the IMF, the Congress, and some people around the president work together in order to maintain domination over whatever, Guatemala or Cuba or the Congo. You don't only see purely capitalist interest, you also see power for the sake of power. When you read Kissinger or when you read Kennan or when you read Brzezinski, those big brains of US diplomacy and the equivalent people for France or Britain earlier on, they don't only have profits in their mind. For sure, what they do doesn't hurt their capitalist class, but it's more that you have an alliance between state powers and military domination and between capitalist frenzy over profits. So I would say that it's almost like a conjunction of those two. And we could also add ideological phenomena like the civilization culture or the development ideology that we're going to bring development to the Congo and to Vietnam and stuff like that. And the development of technology, sorry if I already mentioned it. So those four elements, the capital accumulation, state domination, ideology, and technical development, all of those are somehow complicit and somehow working together and somehow responsible for ecological collapse and for uneven enrichment and sometimes for maintaining people in hunger and poverty and also for wars and so on. So I wouldn't be, some people would argue that capitalism is responsible for poverty and that capitalism is responsible for ecological collapse. I would say that capitalism doesn't function without strong military power and without strong states, and capitalism doesn't function without certain forms of ideological control, and capitalism would be, and state powers would be way less effective without appropriate technological development. So that's what I told you the other day, that I would call the four horsemen of capitalism, of apocalypse, the four horsemen that are responsible for these things.
Okay, so to conclude this interview, so what alternative economic and social system do you see to survive to this ecological collapse?
Yeah, I think that everything that I mentioned so far, or those four horsemen, they're fundamentally not pro-freedom, and they're fundamentally not pro-individual, and they're fundamentally not pro-democracy. They're all the opposite. They're pro-uniformization of the world, they're pro-ideological control, they're pro-standardization, and they're pro-control. So I would say that a counterpower to that is true democracy, is true what we could call anarchy in the historical sense of the term, which is the absence of illegitimate power of some groups over some other groups. So these are really directions in which we need to go. So to be more concrete, what it means is that I'm a big believer in dismantling corporations that are too big, in distributing economic power away from shareholders who have no legitimacy. And by the way, most shareholders, they don't bring money to firms. It's the opposite. Shareholders, they buy shares from other shareholders on the secondary market, and then they extract money of the corporation through dividends. So shareholders are basically parasitic. There is no reason, there is no philosophical, ethical, aesthetical, intellectual reason to maintain this state of power within shareholder hands. So that's something that should be distributed. So breaking the big corporations, giving the power to people who work and who consume, what we call stakeholders, but in a serious way, not just we pretend that we give power to stakeholders and it's just bullshit and blah blah and some committee with some employee delegates who are basically in the end colluded with the bosses and with the managers who are here to serve their own interest and shareholder interest and so on. And basically, we need to have democracy within workplace. I think that would already be a very big deal if instead of having capitalism, so those who bring the capital or who pretend bringing the capital, who have control over economic production, we have something more like worker control and people who work in a certain place to be able to say how production is run. So that's a first thing. A second thing is that what we call democracy right now is an insult to the concept of democracy. Democracy is not about electing some buffoon or some king or some whatever we want to call it, and then giving him or her, but mostly him, full powers or near total powers during 4 or 5 years, and then coming back again with another fake choice in order to give them again the power and to be able to do nothing in between. That's the opposite of democracy. That's basically just validating a king and then telling him you have the keys for 5 years. By the way, those kings elected are often not the brightest. They're just the ones who arrange very strong corporate interests. For example, the Biden versus Trump campaigns was around 12 billions. So it's not just that you can have the best ideas. You also need to find a lot of money. And in order to find a lot of money, you need to say stuff that is not against the interest of those who hold a lot of money. So that's a second thing to investigate. What does a true democracy look like? So, for example, the Athenian model that people quote when they say democracy was not about elections. It was about randomness. It was about everyone being participating in debates in the agora, and then sometimes delegated people out of random and tracking them and have the power to kick them out of their temporary responsibility if they're not doing the job. So I don't elect a king. I say, you, Lamia, out of randomness or out of decisions because you have appropriate skills, you're going to do this precise mission and then you're done. And me, I'm going to do this precise mission and then I'm done. That's much closer to a democracy. Athens was by no means perfect because it had lots of slaves, about 4 slaves or 3 or 4 slaves for one citizen. Women didn't have citizen power and so on and so forth. But at least it was closer to what would be an interesting model of democracy for the 21st century. I think that another track is to look at how technology is developed and for whom. And I won't go into details, but right now the model of technological development we have, whether it's in pharma, whether it's in electronics, whether it's in other industries like that, is that you have public subsidies for research during decades, and by the time it gets profitable enough, you privatize it through intellectual property tools like copyrights for certain type of items or like patents for others and so on and so forth. Then you get that into a startup, and when the startup is mature enough or lucrative enough or promising enough, it gets acquired by a big corporate actor. So that's basically state subsidies for big private powers. That's the opposite of, of free market and of meritocracy. And that's very stupid because we're developing useless technological stuff that ends up into private powers. And we don't need more technology at the moment. What we need actually is technology that's at the service of people who need to use it, and not that makes us serve the technology. So for example, right now, many people, including young people, spend more than 5 hours on their smartphone, and they're not spending it on educational channels or on documentaries. They're spending it on stupid stuff like Instagram reels or TikToks or short videos, or liking, or algorithms that are fundamentally designed in order to keep our attention on this and to stimulate dopamine in order to sell more ads. So those are totally stupid technologies that we need to dismantle, and we need to basically put into democratic control. I'll give you just one example, and then I leave you the floor. But right now, around my place, there's a big 15 meters antenna for 5G that's being planned. People in the neighborhood are opposing it because it's 15 meters, it's ugly, we have good network, we don't care about augmented reality or stuff like that 5G is supposed to bring, and we don't want that crap. And some people think it's bad for health, some others don't care, but they just say, I don't want it, and I think it's stupid. So what we have to go through is first filing lots of stuff through the municipality, paying lawyers for that. Then the municipality gets blocked by the superior authority. And then we go to a court. And then the court says, no, but we have ruled at a federal level that we need 5G in the country and that you don't have a say. So the municipality is powerless. The people in the neighborhood are powerless, and so on. Is that a democratic model for some stupid stuff like 5G, which basically is supposed to bring medical care by distance, which is bullshit, and mostly brings just stupid stuff like AR and more instant videos. So those are all things that we need to bring back under democratic control. So I encourage people to Google and to read about, in a serious way, terms such as democracy or such as anarchy, but not elections and not chaos. Those are wrong terms for democracy and anarchy. And a last thing is what we could call democratic socialism. I think there are interesting things around that. But again, if you think that I'm talking about Stalin, then I think you're under ideology. No one is speaking about putting a dictatorship like the USSR when you mean democratic socialism. So tons of people who have written books about that. I leave people who are interested, go and check them. Democracy, anarchy, democratic socialism, and things like that. And of course, degrowth is a set of academic research that combines all those ideas.
And so you spoke a lot about the concept of democracy, anarchy. Maybe any books you want to recommend before we finish?
Yeah, definitely. Thanks. So I think that Vandana Shiva that you quoted is often associated with anti-globalism movements and with degrowth and with radical ecology. I think she's a really good author. I would recommend in this field, I think the best introductory book, in my opinion, is Less is More by Jason Hickel, which is also in the degrowth atmosphere. So that's one. Then a second one, I would recommend, let's say, Understanding Power from Noam Chomsky. Who is maybe the most important anarchist intellectual from the 20th century. Really powerful, good stuff. Maybe a third book that I would recommend, it's by Fernand Braudel, the historian of capitalism. It's called La dynamique du capitalisme in French. I guess it's translated as Capitalism Dynamics in English. Very short book. The guy has spent decades on the history of capitalism. At the end of his career, he was like, okay, I know people don't have time to read my thousands of pages. I'll make a 100-page summary. So no excuse. I think that people can check a book that really blew my mind in 2019 when I was still at BCG and that triggered a lot of thinking, is called The Sixth Extinction from Elizabeth Colbert. A really good book to understand what or how humans, and more specifically the capitalist industrial system created by the West, is killing life on the planet. And perhaps a last one, let me advise, let's say The History of the World in 7 Cheap Things by Raj Patel and Jason W. Moore. Very interesting book from authors that are focused a lot on non-Western thinking and on how capitalism developed, not by taking English factories, but by taking colonies, which is very interesting and which is very smart, in my opinion. And perhaps, yet another one in the same kind of field, wrote by someone who's a novelist. So if you don't want to go into something that's too academic, this book is not a novel, it's an essay, but very well written in a story tone and with a lot of sources. So it's not just fantasy. It's called The Nutmeg's Curse. Very interesting title. How the nutmegs has been a curse that killed lots of people in Indonesia in the 17th century when the Dutch arrived, and that basically traces history of Western imperialism, capitalism, technology, and also thinking, and how it spread all over the planet. So I guess that's a good list.
Well, thank you, Victor Cannilla, for this very insightful interview. It was very great to have you with us today. And thank you for watching us, and see you soon.
Thanks, everyone, and thanks, Lamiaa.